The account of the flood, centered on the figure of Noah, is one of the most striking and universally recognized events in the entire biblical narrative. More than an ancient story, it echoes across millennia, crossing cultural boundaries and leaving traces in the myths and traditions of nearly every continent. Peoples of Asia, Oceania, Europe, the Americas, and Africa preserved, each in their own way, the memory of a great deluge that devastated the world and reshaped the destiny of humanity. This convergence of accounts suggests that the event described in the Bible resonated far beyond the pages of Scripture, becoming part of global memory. Yet the antediluvian world held its own mysteries. The Bible states that in the days preceding the flood, and even during it, giants lived among men, imposing beings, corrupted, and considered the result of forbidden unions in the eyes of the Creator. These colossal beings were, according to the sacred text, swept from the earth when the waters rose. Even so, one enigma lingers like a shadow over the narrative. If all were destroyed in the waters of divine judgment, how can we explain the surprising reappearance of giants after the flood? This mystery spans generations and resurfaces in the days of Abraham, when certain Canaanite peoples were already known for harboring giants. Later, during the time of Moses, Joshua, Caleb, and even throughout the turbulent era of the Judges, these beings continued to exist, leaving their mark upon the landscapes and battles of the Promised Land, and their presence did not vanish with the passing of centuries. Even in the reign of David, the young shepherd who faced the fearsome Goliath, descendants of these colossi still roamed the region. This video is another chapter in our journey excavating the mysteries of the giants in Scripture, especially the intriguing phenomenon of their return after the waters of the flood had theoretically erased their lineage. Biblical giants are almost always associated with the enigmatic Nephilim, beings who appear in Scripture as descendants of the mysterious sons of God and the daughters of men. In Genesis 6:1-4, the narrative takes on a tone of profound mystery, as if human history had been interrupted by something that came from beyond the physical world. As humanity multiplied upon the earth, the boundary between the spiritual realm and the world of mortals seemed to rupture, giving rise to imposing figures, beings of extraordinary strength whose fame echoed across millennia. The text highlights that there were giants in those days, and then adds, briefly and almost in a whisper, yet deeply unsettling, and also afterward. This short expression, laden with enormous theological weight, has challenged scholars for centuries. Many argue that the sons of God were fallen angels who abandoned their celestial estate and violated the boundaries set by the Most High by taking human women for themselves. From this forbidden union would have been born the Nephilim, hybrid beings who belonged fully to neither world. Other interpreters suggest that the text merely describes distinct human lineages, the faithful descendants of Seth mixing with the rebellious lineage of Cain, though this explanation drastically diminishes the supernatural tone that permeates the account. Even so, the oldest traditions preserved among Jewish groups and recorded by communities such as the Essenes point to the original interpretation: celestial beings crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed. The presence of giants appears again in the Book of Numbers when Moses' spies return from Canaan deeply shaken. They report having seen the descendants of Anak, men so tall and imposing that the spies themselves felt like grasshoppers in comparison. This sense of insignificance reveals that these were not merely above-average humans, but creatures whose stature and power inspired terror in any who witnessed them. For many centuries, the passage of Genesis 6 was treated almost as a forbidden text, avoided by interpreters due to its disturbing nature and unsettling spiritual implications. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved at Qumran for more than 2,000 years, offer a strikingly clear echo of the oldest explanation. Rebellious angels descended to earth, united with human women, and produced a hybrid race that corrupted creation. This tradition, far from marginal, was dominant among early Jewish communities and shaped their understanding of the events leading up to the flood. According to this view, the sons of God took for themselves the daughters of Adam, and from them were born giants of astonishing appearance, nearly inhuman strength, and a reputation that endured for generations. They were feared warriors, men of renown, whose deeds became part of the ancient world's imagination. This ancient interpretation opens the door to the great mystery of the narrative, how beings who should have been destroyed by the waters of the flood walked the earth again, and how their presence shaped entire centuries of biblical history. As we carefully journey through the scriptures, one detail inevitably stands out: the unexpected reappearance of giants after the flood. They emerge in various regions, scattered among peoples with no direct relation to one another, suggesting that their existence continued in some unknown manner. This presence spans books such as Deuteronomy, Joshua, Samuel, and Chronicles, demonstrating that these extraordinary beings did not vanish with the waters, but remained active, shaping battles, territories, and the destinies of entire nations. In the days of King David, when Goliath and other colossal warriors still walked the valleys of Israel, the giants were a tangible reality, not mere ancient legends. Over time, some have attempted to reinterpret these accounts, suggesting that the biblical giants were simply exceptionally tall humans who arose naturally after the flood. However, this theory collapses quickly when confronted with modern records and biblical descriptions. Guinness World Records mentions individuals who reached unusual heights, slightly above 8 feet, but such people face severe limitations: fragile bones, deformities, intense pain, difficulty walking, and drastically shortened life expectancy, often not surpassing 30 years. The giants of Scripture, however, are described in an entirely different way. They were not weak or debilitated. On the contrary, they were vigorous warriors, capable of facing entire battalions and wielding weapons of extraordinary weight. Their armor could easily exceed 100 pounds, far above the common equipment of the time, which weighed only 10 or 12 pounds. No human with modern gigantism would be capable of lifting, let alone skillfully using, such weapons in battle. Moreover, ancient records make it clear that these giants possessed endurance far beyond what we would consider possible for an ordinary human. They advanced against entire lines of soldiers without showing fatigue, without hesitation before spears and swords, as if their bodies had been forged for war. The biblical giants are depicted as true colossi, relentless and nearly indestructible on the battlefield. The contrast is so profound that it becomes impossible to classify them in the same category. The divide between biblical descriptions and modern examples is not merely wide, it is unbridgeable. Clearly, we are dealing with two completely different types of beings. The scriptures preserve their heights in cubits, a unit of measurement which, when translated into modern values, reveals the overwhelming physical dimensions of these creatures, making clear how overwhelmingly they stood out among the peoples of their time. And among all post-flood giants mentioned in Scripture, none is as imposing or as frequently remembered as Og, king of Bashan. He is not merely described as a military leader, but as the sovereign of the Rephaim, a whole race of giants that surprisingly continued to exist even after the great judgment of the waters. The Rephaim, or Rephaim, carry a name that literally means the dead, as if they were echoes of an ancient age, shadows lingering from a world that should have been wiped out by the flood, but somehow persisted at the edges of human history. Ancient traditions affirm that these Rephaim reached around 13 feet in height, and there are indications that some may have exceeded even this impressive measure, but Og stands above them all. Deuteronomy 3:1 records his dimensions with an almost unsettling precision, about 9 cubits tall and 4 cubits wide. Converting the Hebrew cubit, approximately 21 inches, we find a being around 13 feet tall and more than 7 feet wide at the shoulders, proportions that completely defy any human reference. We are not speaking of a man who was merely tall, we are speaking of a titan. To visualize a figure rising 13 feet from the ground, with shoulders spanning more than 7 feet, is to imagine the presence of a colossus walking among ordinary men, and this in an age when the average Israelite stood around 5 feet 4 inches. The mere sight of such a warrior would be enough to paralyze entire armies. He would dominate the horizon, casting a shadow that stretched like a foreboding omen of incomprehensible strength. These accounts make it clear that the giants were not simply different. They were radically distinct from ordinary humanity. Their extraordinary height was only one of the elements that set them apart. Everything about them was exaggerated, colossal, far beyond known standards. They were beings who seemed to belong to another category of creation, creatures so astonishing that the ancients struggled to find words capable of capturing their terrifying proportions. With each preserved description, it becomes evident that we are not dealing with mere tall men, but with a race that surpassed all human parameters. Beyond the story of Og, the titanic king of Bashan, another biblical account reinforces this astonishing image. The episode of the 12 spies sent by Moses to scout the land of Canaan. When they returned, their testimony was filled with awe and even terror. They described the height of the inhabitants of that land as something so immense that they felt reduced to insignificant creatures. In direct comparison, the giants appeared as enormous grasshoppers, while the Israelites seemed like tiny insects before them. The difference in size was not merely great, it was overwhelming. And what is most intriguing, the giants seen by the spies did not belong to the race of the Rephaim, but to another impressive lineage, the Anakim, descendants of Anak, one of the most feared families of the ancient world. These beings dominated valleys and fortresses with their height and strength, creating an atmosphere of intimidation that left the Israelites terrified. This is the first moment after the flood in which we find a biblical narrative so explicit and detailed about a people of giants who seem to defy human logic. And it is at this point that the question becomes even deeper and more intriguing. If the giants were destroyed by the flood, how could they be there, alive, strong, and increasingly numerous? How did they reappear centuries after the waters supposedly erased their lineage from the earth? To understand this mystery, several interpretations arose throughout history below. I present some of these possibilities, not as definitive statements, but as ancient reflections that have crossed the ages. I invite you to consider which one seems most convincing. The first view attempts to answer the question directly. Some giants may have survived the flood. According to certain rabbinic writings and very ancient Jewish traditions, some of these beings found extraordinary means to escape total destruction. Some rabbis affirm that God allowed the survival of specific giants so that, in the period following the flood, people could see with their own eyes what remained of a race on the brink of extinction, a living testimony that divine judgment had been fulfilled. Some ancient Jewish commentators even suggest that Og, the giant who would later become king of Bashan, somehow survived near the ark. Although the biblical text does not confirm this, other rabbinic traditions claim that giants took refuge on impossibly high mountains and that the waters did not reach their legs, even above the highest peaks. In more legendary versions, it is said that the water rose only to their knees as they continued walking over submerged valleys. But this view is in direct conflict with the biblical narrative, which explicitly states that all the mountains of the earth were completely submerged, covered by more than 20 feet of water above their summits, and it is precisely here that other, even more intriguing hypotheses arise. The second hypothesis, presented by some ancient scholars, is that of survival by their own means, the idea that certain giants escaped the flood by building their own vessels. According to this theory, these colossal beings understood the imminence of the catastrophe and, endowed with extraordinary strength and skill, constructed massive boats capable of traversing the turbulent waters while the world sank around them. Visually, this idea may seem powerful. Giants handling immense tree trunks, shaping planks with brute force, building vessels as large as fortresses. The image almost feels like something from an ancient epic, titans resisting divine judgment through colossal engineering. However, This theory lacks solid support from any reliable source. There is no biblical indication that giants prepared their own means of survival. No apocryphal book, pseudepigraphal text, or respected ancient writing mentions titans sailing in private ships while humanity perished beneath the waters. On the contrary, the entire biblical narrative points to complete destruction, an annihilation of all flesh, except for the lives preserved inside the ark. Even so, the mere emergence of this theory reveals how deeply the mystery of post-flood giants continues to fascinate, leading many to imagine improbable possibilities to explain their existence. Possibilities that, even if unlikely, still leave a lingering question. The third interpretation, and for many the most solid and coherent, is that giants existed again after the flood because the fallen angels returned to earth and once more took human women, repeating the same sin described in Genesis 6. This view attempts to unite the scattered fragments of Scripture into a continuous explanation, capable of clarifying why entire peoples occupied Canaanite territories with heights and strengths far beyond the ordinary. The key lies in that enigmatic phrase in Genesis 6, "in those days and also afterward." Few words, yet loaded with implication. Many scholars understand that this expression was not written by accident. It seems to suggest that the phenomenon of the Nephilim, those hybrid beings born of a forbidden union, was not limited to the pre-flood era, but returned at some later time, infiltrating human history once again. And this understanding gains even more strength when we consider the testimony of the New Testament. Especially in the letters of Peter, we find references to angels who sinned, who abandoned their proper domain, and who were therefore imprisoned in pits of darkness, kept for the final judgment. These texts directly echo the ancient accounts of the Watchers, the rebellious angels mentioned in Jewish tradition, who allegedly descended to earth to take human form and produce offspring. What is most astonishing is how these New Testament writings seem to align with what we read in Genesis. The biblical narrative does not explicitly state the exact moment when God punished these beings, but many theologians believe that the judgment and imprisonment of these fallen angels occurred only after the flood, precisely when the phenomenon surfaced again. Thus, the giants who appeared in the days of Abraham, Moses, and Joshua would be the result of this second wave of celestial transgression. This understanding casts a completely new light on the post-flood giants. They would not be survivors of the flood, nor merely tall human beings, but rather a new generation of hybrids, produced by the repetition of the same forbidden act that had corrupted the world before the judgment of the waters. And the New Testament mentions this episode in a surprisingly direct way, almost shocking to some readers, yet incredibly meaningful when analyzed alongside the ancient narratives. The giant races after the flood. When we follow the biblical narrative beyond the flood, we see that the presence of giants not only continued, but diversified into new lineages. The Old Testament clearly records that different peoples in different regions carried traits of this colossal ancestry. They did not form a single race, but multiple groups, each with its own peculiarities and its own impact on the history of ancient nations. Among these peoples, 5 stand out as the primary giant lineages mentioned in Scripture: Rephaim, one of the oldest and most feared races, often associated with vast and mountainous territories. They were known for their devastating strength and enormous stature, so much so that they were remembered as shadows of a pre-flood past. Rephates, a term often used as a variation of Rephaim, but also associated with specific groups inhabiting regions such as Bashan and the Valley of Rephaim. Their warriors were legendary, and many believed they carried the echo of the giants destroyed by the judgment of the waters. Anakim, the descendants of Anak, the race seen by Moses' spies. They were so immense that the Israelites compared themselves to tiny grasshoppers before them. They inhabited fortified cities and terrified anyone who dared step into their territory. Emim giants, who lived in the plains of Moab, described as a large and powerful people. Their name in Hebrew carries the sense of fear or terror, perfectly reflecting the impact they had on others. Zuzim, Zamzumim, an ancient tribe of giants who lived in the region of Ammon. The name Zamzumim means something like those who murmur or booming noise, perhaps referring to their speech or their intimidating presence. 5 major lineages. 5 colossal peoples who shaped post-flood history. 5 echoes of the transgression mentioned in Genesis, and at the same time, 5 testimonies that something extraordinary happened again after the waters receded. I sincerely hope you enjoyed this deep exploration into the mystery of the giants after the flood, a topic that has fascinated scholars, historians, and readers of scripture for centuries. Now that you know the main interpretations, reflect: which one seems most true to you? Which explanation resonates most with your understanding of scripture? Share your thoughts, your perspective matters. May the peace of God be with you all, and we'll meet again soon.